Thank you to the Turkish National Committee for inviting me to do this. I don't normally need too much of a prompt to talk about this subject. It is a balance between the more traditional view of CIE and the view of a rather long in the tooth, as we say, which means I've been doing it a long time, public health professional. So we all know that we have light during the day and we have dark at night, we hope, and we've evolved under that. And what we look at is that from a public health perspective, and increasingly to do with mental health. People worry a lot about the physical harm and the physical benefits of exposure to optical radiation, but we're more and more concerned now about the mental aspects, particularly, I suppose, over the last year and a bit. And we need to go to the World Health Organization's definition of health, which is all encompassing. So health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And that was when the WHO was set up in 1948. That was in its original statutes, and they're still very valid today. We know we have the solar spectrum. The top plot is outside the atmosphere, and the one underneath is in the UK. So we lose a lot of optical radiation as it comes through the atmosphere. But the important point is the bit down the end is missing, which has some implications for us, mainly beneficial. And in many of the modern technologies, we have the top end missing, which may actually have some health implications. And we're all familiar with the visible bit in the middle. Now, the human race evolved outdoors. We're an outdoor species, and we are used to quite relaxing colors, basically blues and greens. And really the science of optical radiation started by the Greeks and I guess other people in the area, but the Ibn al-Haytham was the first one to really look at optics from a scientific perspective, and his work was translated in the Middle Ages. Now, in terms of our vision, we need to look at how our vision evolved. Now, some of you may be able to pick out the snake in that picture, but when it's stationary, it can sit there and you can walk past it and wouldn't have any problems. Now, from my perspective, because in the UK, we only have one poisonous snake, which is very unusual to find. I'm not sure what the situation is in Turkey, but in many parts of the world, obviously, we will worry a lot about snakes. But our eyes don't really pick out a static object like that doesn't have bright colors. If we're being chased by something, then yes, we're going to identify it because it's moving. And we notice a change of colors in things. So berries and fruit, which may tell us that it's ripe or bad or whatever. But in our modern environment, most of us don't get chased by wild animals, and a significant proportion of the population doesn't go and forage for its own food, perhaps to its own detriment. So the colors that we are seeing are often artificial and often enhanced or whatever by people who want us to see things in a particular way. It's important that in terms of proper colors of objects that we have metrics to base that against, hence the color chart there. And some people are working in environments like this, which are a long way from the environment in which we evolved. And our vision hasn't quite adapted to this sort of environment. The stripes are particularly disturbing to some people, and you'll have people who will have problems just with the visual impact of that, but equally the arrangement of the lights may have problems. Well, some people do like that sort of environment, but in general, people don't find that a very natural place to be. So of course, the whole point about light is it has to get into the body, and we're assuming that our primary exposure route is through the eye. And our eyes and heads have evolved to make sure that we are protected from the sun and the glare from the sun. And so whilst the source is overhead, we're shielded from it. When it comes down into our field of view, generally it's traveling through the atmosphere and it's not as bright as the overhead source. So again, our artificial environment is changing that, and particularly when people get it wrong, you have the source right in your field of view. And we know we can adapt to lighting levels, and I'm going to come back to this a bit later on. So in low light levels, we have the pupil opens right up. When it gets brighter, it shuts down. And if it gets too bright, we tend to shut our eyes and avoid it. I'm sure you've all seen pictures like this before, but just to recognize that the sensors at the back of the eye on the retina are actually backwards. So they're seeing light that's gone through quite a few cells before it gets to the sensors. The rods and the cones, the rods give us black and white images essentially, and the cones give us color and detail. And it's the cones that react very quickly. So they're the ones that are going to tell us that a wild animal is moving fast in our peripheral vision. And we're then going to turn and look at it and put the image onto the fovea, central part of the eye here. But another thing we'll come back to later on is the fact that some of these cells between the back structure of the retina and the sensor cells are actually photosensitive themselves. So these are retinal ganglion cells in here, and some of these photosensitive, which is why they're called photosensitive, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. What we're always trying to do, if we're thinking about it properly, is we want to optimize the benefit from exposure to optical radiation. So if we take visible light, if we don't have enough, we tend to fall over things, bump into things. If we have too much, it affects our vision and ultimately could damage our vision. If we have ultraviolet, then not enough, and we suffer from vitamin D deficiency. If we have too much, we may get skin cancer. Infrared, not enough, we might be cold. Too much, and we burn. So we can use that model for everything to do with optical radiation. But also to recognize the evolution of lighting technology has always had some potential adverse public health implications. So when our ancestors first started to light fires, some of them would have got burnt, some would have set the whole environment on fire, but it had the benefit, obviously you could see, and possibly ward off wild animals. Then the evolution through the fish lamp, through candles, oil lamps, up to gas lamps, all have safety issues, potential public health issues because of the flame and the fumes that are produced. And even our dear old friend, the incandescent light bulb, has potential issues. When the very early light bulbs gave out very small amount of light, their luminance levels were very low, which meant you could stare at them. A lot of people find it quite relaxing to stare into a candle flame or into a fire. But with these lamps, originally you could stare into them, but as they got brighter, as the luminance increased, we then had to actually start doing something to decrease the luminance by putting diffusers around the source, or even putting shades around so we can't see the source. We don't like staring at something that's very bright. Now, I suppose the first time we really got involved in health issues was to do with fluorescent lights. And the concern was twofold. One is they give out UV, and therefore, is it a good idea to sit under a UV lamp all the time? Up until lockdown, my office here had UV filtered fluorescent lamps with a plastic filter over them. The one example there, there's a more recent installation where people have forgotten why the plastic filters were there. So they try and increase the light output by taking the plastic filters away, and you have UV exposure people underneath, hopefully at a low level. The other concern with them was they produce a very peaky spectrum, And was there some biological interaction that could take place in us, either in the eyes or on the skin, that might trigger a particular adverse health effect? That has not been found. But it was a major concern with fluorescent lights. But then the original fluorescent lights were magnetically ballasted, therefore they flickered at 100 hertz in Europe, 120 hertz in the US and other places. But as we moved to high frequency fluorescence, that problem went away. This is where, certainly in the UK, problems really started to appear with public health issues. And nothing focuses the mind of government more than the public complaining about something, because the public can write to their members of parliament and complain, and then that means that someone has to respond. So with these, we were aware that some particular patients, those suffering from lupus erythematosus, seemed to have their symptoms worsened if they were using compact fluorescent lamps. And we discovered there was a fair amount of UV and indeed some UVC coming from these, which meant you could exceed the limits in the European Artificial Optical Radiation Directive. But there seemed to be some other issues. Of course, they took a long time to warm up. They, again, have a very peaky spectrum. They had one major benefit. For the first time, you effectively had a cold source you could put right beside your head. So if you suffered from poor vision, you suddenly had a light source you could use to read. And so we had this balance between those who absolutely hated these and those who loved them. And then when we moved on to LEDs, where we are now, originally the technology was not very good, same with compact fluorescent lamps. The technology being developed by electronics specialists and not by lighting specialists, who are going for high efficiency without understanding some of the problems you can create by having high luminance sources, going right back to the original problems as incandescent lamps improved. We do see a lot of public health issues with these. I'll come on to in a minute. The other big public health issue is to do with streetlights. Many parts of the world have sodium lamps, and I suppose people adapt to the fact you can't find your car having parked it because it's changed colour. You just need to know where you left it rather than look out for it. But moving to LED streetlights, particularly those with very high colour temperature in a residential area, causes concerns from the public. And it's one of these situations where people talk to each other and the symptoms can spread. So you have one person in the road who says, I don't like these LED streetlights because they're causing me some adverse health effect. And the other one will say, well, yes, I get headaches with these things. And so it spreads. And then you get people who complain about light at night. You know, if you've got a street light outside your house, the obvious solution to that is to draw the curtains. But some people like to have the curtains open and feel it's their human right to be able to watch the night sky. And I can see the advantage of that. But again, what are they really worried about? Because if we think that it's blue light that's causing the problem, then all you need to do is shut your eyes, because blue light does not transmit through the eyelids very well at all. That's sort of experiment we sometimes do with students to show how little blue light goes through the eyelid. But an interesting group of complaints, which wasn't quite what we were expecting, was as the ability to control the footprint of an LED street light increased, we had complaints from people who could no longer see the keyhole in their front door, which was always lit up by the old street lights. And it had to be pointed out to them, they had no right to have their front gardens lit by a community street light. And the media can trigger problems. We don't tend to need to monitor the media because the public do it for us. So you know when something's been published that's going to cause concern. This study was quite a good study. It's looking at satellite data and the distribution of streetlights, and it was correlating that with breast and prostate cancer. But the media launch of the paper put a slightly different twist on it, which was that it was LED street lighting that was causing the problem. But if you look at the paper, the LED street lights were only installed in the last year of the study. So any effect on health was nothing to do with LED streetlights. And there have been suggestions that where you have more streetlights, you sometimes have more nightlife, and sometimes perhaps more fast food and other lifestyle factors that might actually have more impact on cancer risk. Blue light has been of interest to a number of researchers, partly because the sensitivity of the intrinsically sensitive retinal ganglion cells are about the same peak wavelength as the blue light hazard. Blue light hazard is, function is set by the International Commission on Non-ionizing Radiation Protection, and it peaks at about 470 nanometers. So if we look at this just on a slightly different scale, the problem probably isn't adults. The problem is young children. This bit of the spectrum up here that goes up to a phakic, that continues up about a factor of 8 above the peak value for an adult. So very young children are much more susceptible to blue light. Not necessarily to damage, but they can certainly see it far better. And one of the problems with technology is it's not designed for children, young children in particular. So the designer may well be an adult, even if it's a startup company with a spin out from university, perhaps. The people doing the work are probably in their 20s and 30s. And the blue vision has already started to decrease by that level. And if the product is aimed at teenagers and younger, any blue emitters on the product will be dazzlingly bright to the young children. Even it surprised me, we designed a piece of equipment that had blue LEDs in it to mimic water. It was sort of water boiling. And it looked perfectly okay to me, but my teenage children at the time couldn't look at it. It was just too bright. And the problem, of course, with very young babies is they seek out light sources. So what you don't want is babies staring at lights, which is why the standard for toys restricts the amount of blue light now in toys. So it's that bit at the top there that we worry about. But in terms of blue light exposure, many of the studies that have been done and published assume that you're staring at the light source. Now, that isn't what we actually do. We tend to get a number of exposures throughout the day, and providing we don't hit the limit in a day, we're okay. And then there's a certain amount of recovery. So we assume 8 hours is all the same as 24 hours. And by the next day, restarting everything. So paper that Dave Sliney, Rob Bergman and I produced a couple of years back was trying to explain this common sense approach to the risks from light sources. We also thought it would be a good idea to put light sources in perspective with the blue sky. If people are worried about blue light, how many people are worried about blue light from the sky? Admittedly, you shouldn't be staring at the sun, but if you've got nice blue sky, I'm sure blue skies in Turkey are much nicer than blue skies in the UK, although there is quite a bit of blue sky out there at the moment. But in June, the blue sky in the UK is about 10% of the exposure limit if you stare at it all day. Most people don't have time to be staring at the sky all day. So we looked at various lamp technologies to put that in perspective. And there are several important values here. One is how far up the exposure limit we were, but also what we term the hazard ratio. So we take the luminance in lumens per meter squared per steradian, so candelas per meter squared, and divide that into our limit. We can see what proportion of the limit we have for a given output of the source. And what you can see here is that the LEDs, incandescent and compact fluorescent lights, are all about the same value, same hazard value. And when you go to a big panel, then it increases just very slightly. So we weren't too worried about light sources, especially as there's this sort of notional trigger level. If you're above 10 to the 4 candelas per meter squared, people will tend not to look at the source. They'll avoid it. And these sources up here are all way above that value. So you're not going to look at it. They should be shielded. So CIE published a position statement on this just to try and reassure people that the blue light hazard is only really a problem if you've got a blue light source or a violet source and you stare at it. But even so, many consumer products, for some reason, have blue LEDs on them. And anyone who has there's a router and a phone, and if you look at them in the dark, if you get up in the middle of the night and these things are on, it can completely light up the room. And that's because you're now using your rod vision, which is very sensitive to blue light. And sort of complaints we get through the public through to government tend to be on light sources, something like this, which they claim is very, very blue. But if you're out doing some sort of motorcycling or cycling in the dark, and someone shines that at you, it's going to completely wipe out your night vision. And that's actually a bigger risk than the actual light source itself. But for some reason, cars trigger a lot of interest. And we had someone who wrote to our Minister of Transport, so that the politician who heads the transport ministry, saying if he could ever prove that someone had died as a result of the blue light coming out of the vehicle lighting, he would bring a class action against him. A lot of it comes back to common sense. High luminance sources in your field of view are not a good idea. So daylight running lights, which are very, very blue and very, very focused, coming from a very small source, just common sense says you wouldn't do that. And I think we're seeing a change from the automotive industry. The other thing that causes people a lot of concern is when they don't have control. So I have a desk lamp that's shining on me. You can see the shine off the top of my nearly bald head. But my office does have a light switch. Most of the offices in this building don't. So when you walk into a room, the lights come on if it thinks it needs to put them on, or they go off when you don't move for a bit. I have a switch where I can actually turn that off here, and I like that control. And that's true of most people. You know, in olden days when you had your own office, fortunately I still do have my own office, but you have your office with your desk lamp, people like the idea of being able to control their lighting. And if you put in more complex lighting control systems, people will often find the nice value that they want to stick with, and they totally ignore the rest of the controls. As time has gone on, there seems to be a growing group of people who have what we term non-specific adverse health effects, which they are blaming on lighting. So they go to their doctor and they say, like, my employer or whoever has changed the lighting in my room where I have to work, and I no longer feel well. We used to get that with fluorescent lights. We used to get it with compact fluorescent lights, and we're getting it more and more with LEDs. And for us, the perfect situation is where we have someone who says, I'm okay in this area and not okay in this other area. We can then look at what the difference is. And we had a fantastic case that was referred to us from a clinician, a consultant neurologist, who had a patient who could go from room to room, and depending on which lights they switched on, depending on how well they felt. And when we looked at it, this is the kitchen, and the spotlights in the ceiling, this is quite an expensive refurbishment of the house. And these spotlights in the ceiling all flickered. There were LEDs in these downlighters here that didn't. And we went through every light source in the house, and this patient could tell us which ones flickered and which ones didn't by their symptoms. Now, okay, they may well have measured it themselves, but we don't think they had done because it wasn't specific to technology, because they had an incandescent light bulb that was on a dimmer, and that was pulsing at 100 hertz. So again, produced the symptoms. And even the refrigerator light produced symptoms. This individual couldn't get their things out of the fridge. They had to get their partner to get things out of the fridge for them. And the light in that kitchen was going on and off 100 times per second. We don't completely understand what's going on. It may be something like the fight or flight response happening 100 times per second, and they're completely unaware of the temporal light modulation. But it might be that every time they move their head, they're seeing an image array. So this is an example most people will be familiar with. If you're following a car that brakes and you move your eyes very suddenly, you see a row of dots, a row of images of the lights. Now, we move our eyes all the time, but normally when we move our eyes, the brain does not accept signals as our eyes are moving to avoid smearing out the image. But if you've got a source that's in your field of view that is pulsing, then your brain will capture the individual pulses. Now, some people like me just find this interesting, but other people find it very, very disturbing. And in the UK, we have road studs, which are LEDs, not on all roads, but on some main roads. And the main motorway from London to Oxford has these. And as you're driving along, you can actually see dots going past your head all the time, which again can be interesting, or it can be very annoying, or it may actually be causing some sort of neurological effect. So we're still working on this. The other aspect of it is stroboscopic effects, where the light source is stationary, but the object being illuminated is moving. Many of us remember these things where you had a strobe on your record player and you could work out whether it was running at the right speed. But if you're working in this sort of environment where you have rotating machinery, first time this was recognized was with fluorescent lights, certainly magnetically ballasted fluorescent lights. If you had a lathe that was rotating, it would appear to be stationary. But now, with LEDs in your kitchen, you may well have a food mixer or food processor where it's been illuminated and strobe illuminated, and it appears to be stationary. Now, fortunately, this doesn't seem to be much of a problem in practice, because where people have LED lighting in their kitchens, often it is indirectly lighting the environment, and you can have multiple reflections, and it doesn't seem to be as much of an effect. But if you had one single LED on a work surface that was illuminating the mixer, you may well find it appears stationary at certain speeds. So we use one of these. If you're not familiar with it, this is a sort of child's fidget spinner. Some schools like them, some schools hate them. But we use these when we go into an unknown environment to test whether the lights flicker. Because one of the roles that we have here at Public Health England is to look after our own staff. And where we have staff who are reporting poor health, headaches when they come into work, they don't have it at home, then the first thing we will do is go and have a look and use the fidget spinner and generally just tell them, we'll sort out the fact that you've now got flickering lights because they fitted LEDs. So most of that was about the detriment. The beneficial effects, of course, light allows us to see. It also is very good at training our circadian rhythm, although it's very difficult not to have your circadian rhythm entrained unless you spend all of your time indoors. So we like bright light during the day and ideally very little light at night. But that does change throughout our life course, and it does depend on the activity we're carrying out. And we tend to have different chronotypes. There are those who prefer to get up in the morning early. There are those who prefer to get up late, and equally at the other end of the day, go to bed early or go to bed late. This study done by Till Ronenberg in Munich is quite interesting in looking at people who, if they are allowed to sleep for as long as they want to and go to bed when they want to, what is the midpoint of their sleep cycle? And these are hours of the day. So you can see some people are peaking at 5 a.m., which means they probably want to stay until about 10 a.m. The difference between males and females, and that the females, the fill circles, they tend to be earlier in the night than the males tend to be later. And the way Till often explains this graph is that depending on the age, when you find your partner, you need to match across to get the same cycle throughout the night. But as you get older, it comes together, and to a certain extent, as we get into our 70s and 80s, females tend to prefer to be in bed longer. And light critically affects our melatonin levels. So during the day, when we have lots of light, melatonin levels are very low. As we go into evening, which would normally be sunset type time, our melatonin levels will increase. And anything we do during the night that gives us particularly blue light exposure will decrease our melatonin levels. Now, the benefits of melatonin are really still being investigated, but it is believed to have a role in body repair. And one of the reasons it is thought that night shift workers may have a higher instance of breast cancer is because they're disrupting their circadian rhythms, disrupting their melatonin production, and therefore not getting that repair. It's a bit of a leap of faith to say that's really what it does, but we do tend to try and encourage people to get dark at night. But then we do normally daft things like fly around the world, and again upset our circadian rhythms and jet lag. A lot of research been done on jet lag, how you resolve it, and the importance of light or not at your destination. And it can work. I'm not sure how much is psychosomatic, but there are apps now that will help you sort out your light cycle to fit in with your moving across time zones. I've used them, but I tend to find that there are other factors that also contribute to whether you get jet lag or not, which also includes the noise on the plane. If you totally block the noise on the plane, you tend to suffer less from jet lag. Then seasonally affective disorder, again, depends where you live in the world as to whether you do have very dismal winters like we do in the UK. We bought every seasonally affective disorder lamp we could find a few years back. You can see by the phone there how long ago this was. And we found that they all gave out different amounts of light and different spectra of light, but they all seemed to work. So how much was just telling someone that sitting in front of this would cure your seasonally affective disorder, and how much was the light actually doing something we don't know? We still use these lamps today, and anyone who thinks they're suffering, we just give them one of these lamps and tell them the symptoms will go away. Now, one of the things about light is if you've got vision, you know that light is interacting with your rods and cones. If you don't have vision, quite an interesting problem was, why does the pupil dilate and close down if you've got no vision? So if you've got no rods and cones, how can that happen? And that's what really led to the idea of these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which in the last 20 years has really taken off, and CIE have produced this standard, mainly because much of the research is unique to that research project. It's very difficult to compare studies between different studies. So this standard was to try and get the researchers to record the data in the correct format. It doesn't tell you what to do with it, having done that. So it's only the first stage of that. And the important thing was to recognize that we have our S, M, and L cones to give us our color vision. We have the rods to give us the night vision. And these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are quite close to the rods. But there's a lot of research still going on in this area. Take into account that we all have a different 24-hour cycle. We do different things at different times, and lots of things that you do can impact on your health, and light is just one of them. So people who suffer from too much caffeine but decide to have a coffee before they go to bed are probably asking for problems. But equally, if you don't get any light during the morning, then you're going to cause problems for yourself that way. So one of the things that we've been looking at is just how variable are all these things. You know, the V-Lander curve, published first by CIE in 1924, is accepted as the response function for color vision. But of course, it is an average. And if you take all these other factors, they're all averages. So whatever advice we give in terms of light exposure, it would never be perfect for everybody. Having said that, we could argue that at night, you should all have dark. But if you either got or ever had young children, you all know that that doesn't always work. They always want some form of light. But the one thing you wouldn't do, and I don't know why this product was on the market, is to have a child's night light that is a blue LED. You'd want something that's bluish, something that's reddish or amberish. In fact, one of the big hotel chains installed blue LED lights to light the way to the bathroom that lit up when you stepped out of the bed, which always seemed a really silly thing to do. So being outside actually is one of the best things we can do. Our indoor environment, we can design the lights. Everyone will have different ideas about what that should be. We can come to the average and do that. But being outside in the morning can do a lot to entrain or ensure our circadian rhythm is entrained. You also get other benefits like a bit of UV exposure for vitamin D production. And also increasingly, there's evidence that the UVA is good for high blood pressure or for reducing high blood pressure. So if you can just tell someone who's got hypertension to go outside around the early part of the day when there's a lot of UVA but not much UVB, then you may actually be doing them a lot of good, as well as the exercise and everything else goes with it. So should people stare at screens at night? We do a lot of talks to schools, and you ask children, well, what are you allowed to use your phone at night? And invariably they say, my parents don't like it, but I sneak it underneath the bed or whatever. And we say, well, tell them that if you go out in the morning for a break from school at about 10 a.m. and get a nice lot of light, then using your phone at night won't affect your sleeping. What you're doing with it might, if you're using it for looking at strange websites. So we do need bright light during the day. It's difficult to quantify that, but generally in most parts of the world, when you go out during the day, you'll be okay. One of the problems we had with lockdown here was government advice was that you should not go outside, you should stay in your house. and that probably did more harm than good. We do need dark at night, and if you don't get that, that can cause problems. But the importance is that ratio. Because there are people where all of this sort of is irrelevant. What you just want is some sort of light. So if you are off-grid in an environment where education may be low, but if you can study, you can improve yourself, then just having any sort of light is better than none. But the trouble is, if that light is a kerosene lamp, then you're close to it because there isn't much light, you're breathing in the fumes, there's a risk of fire. But if you can provide them with an LED lamp that's solar charged during the day, then that will potentially really increase their well-being and increase their potential to perhaps improve their lives by study. So International Day of Light, as was mentioned, was yesterday. There's also this interest in dark skies. I have never seen the stars like that because even though I live in rural England, I'm looking forward to seeing that one day when we improve our street lights around here. But CIE issued a statement about the right recommending proper light at the proper time. So with that, thank you for listening.
We'd like to thank you also for your contribution. Is there anybody who wants to ask any questions to Professor O'Hagan? Or maybe want any contributions? Maybe I can ask you something. Actually, I want what you think about it while the others may prepare their questions. Now, thinking about these pandemic days that we are passing through, what do you think about this daytime, nighttime cycle? Is there any recent study that you're working on or any novelties about it? Because I think lots have changed about this melatonin suppression. I just want to hear your opinions about it.
Well, our opinion, I'm saying our because my group's opinion, along with mine, is that we should have encouraged people to go outdoors a lot more to get the light exposure to because you need that difference in levels. Mm-hmm. If you just stay indoors all the time, you may not actually get as much melatonin as you would if you went out for a walk early in the morning, or in the morning, that doesn't need to be early in the morning, and then spend the rest of your time indoors. There's been an interesting hypothesis. I mean, as you probably know, there are many studies that suggest the timing of drugs can be important. So a drug may be more effective in certain times of the day. And that probably depends on the individual as well. But the vaccine and your response to the vaccine may actually depend on the time of day you're given it. So that's both in terms of, well, it's probably mainly in terms of the adverse effects you get from the vaccine, which also is age dependent. But I think the lockdown in generally has not been good for many people until people were allowed to go out and exercise.
Okay, thank you. Anything you want to add or ask to Professor O'Hagan?
Banu, can I ask a question to John?
Surely, yes. Yes, maybe you can also introduce yourself.
Hello, John. I am Cameron Türkoğlu. Presently, I work in Cyprus. We get too much sun, right. Lots of sunlight. I represent Turkish National Committee in Division 2.
Okay.
Actually, I would like to know more about the spectral content of the if we can say good lighting. I mean, do you believe or do you know more about the full spectrum lighting? Any benefits or any discussions about it? What can you tell us more?
Okay, I will attempt to say something about it. If if you take an LED spectrum and compare it with an incandescent light bulb spectrum, of course, they are significantly different. You can make them look similar in the blue, red, yellow part of the spectrum. The problem is that they don't have any UV. Now, many people would argue that's a good thing not to have the UV, but there may be benefits. What's more interesting is the lack of far red and near infrared, because there's growing evidence that the effect of, let's say, 780, 800 nanometer light on the benefit to the eye and to the retina. People worry about macular degeneration and blue light. The studies only use blue light. But if you take the natural spectrum we get exposed to, because there's much more of the other wavelengths there, and possibly the red light is compensating for any damage that's caused by the blue light. And that is where a lot of the research is going on now, to see whether by having LEDs that don't have the far red and near infrared may potentially cause problems. But of course, it's only an issue if you spend all of your time indoors under that lighting. As soon as you go outdoors, you get lots of red light. Now, up until a year ago, we used to have a monitoring station in Cyprus. We used to monitor the sun and the light at our Acrotiri, but it proved too expensive to maintain, so we brought it back here.
Thank you very much.
I want someone to disagree with me, really.
I'm also checking the chat box.
John, can I ask something about again the pandemic period? For the it's very popular to use the UVC to protect against the virus and to prevent and to spread of them. What do you think about the use of LED for this purpose? Can you evaluate it? Because we are get used to for the fluorescent lamps, and now it's LED also can use this purpose. What do you think about this? Can you evaluate it is a easily usable safety?
The problem always is that UVC, I mean, what I always say to people is that life evolved after UVC stopped reaching the surface of the planet, okay? But UVC 254 mercury or 260, 270 nanometer LEDs are probably very good at inactivating viruses and killing bacteria, providing you haven't got people there. So home use devices should not be on the market. We've recently published a paper on that. We took a sample of, I think, 50 units and found half didn't work at all because they had visible LEDs or UVA LEDs. The other half were dangerous. And people, I mean, historically, most of our involvement in that was where you had insect killing lamps in kitchens, and someone has replaced the UVA lamp with a germicidal UVC lamp, and the injuries are quite characteristic. And of course, the public who have bought similar products that actually emit UVC are discovering the same problems. What is interesting is the development of 222 nanometer UVC. So this does not penetrate anywhere in the skin beyond the dead layer. It possibly will create effects on the eyes, but you could have argued that if the technology had been mature enough at the start of the pandemic to put it into hospitals where most people are covered in personal protective equipment anyway, would have perhaps reduced the spread in hospitals. But there's actually there isn't much evidence for spread in hospitals. It's in other communities, certainly not in the UK. So I think upper air UVC, where people don't get exposed, so it's above your head, probably is good. I would not want to be working under a UV lamp in my office or in a coffee shop or anything like that. So, but of course, there's a lot of money in this, and that's what we're having to be very careful about, is the drive by industry. And we're seeing that the industry is pushing very hard to have the technology rolled out. It does work if you've got, if it works, if you've got the right wavelengths and you've got enough of it. Most LEDs are not powerful enough at the moment to deliver the correct fluence. But it's also something that adds to the disinfection of the environment. You wouldn't rely on it. And the other factor, in the UK, we stopped using UVC disinfection in the 1970s in hospitals when they introduced plastics into the operating theatres, because UVC degrades plastics.
I see.
We end up having to replace the infrastructure, the floor, and many of the fittings in there. But in some countries still use it, and where you have a lot of TB, it's a very, very effective control measure.
Yes, we will see.
Yeah.
Thanks, Belko.
Okay.
Okay, any other contributions or questions?
I have a question,
Yes,
maybe a
please.
magazine question, but now all our cell phones have a blue light filter, which automatically operates around the sunset. Do you think, are they reliable?
They are a good marketing ploy.
Right? Just
So
change the color of the screen.
it does change. You can actually see it. If you compare one screen that doesn't have the filter and one with, it is changing the colors. I find it a bit strange. I think if you went outside in the morning, got your bright light, you wouldn't need this filter. It's really for people who don't go outside. It's like your optician, next time you go for an eye checkup, may sell you a blue light filter for your glasses.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to do anything. Because the amount of attenuation the blue light filter gives you is insignificant compared with the different levels of blue light you'll experience throughout the day going outside. So don't waste your money on blue light filters in your glasses.
Okay, I have blue light filter on.
I would
you.
go back and complain.
Okay.
Banu, I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, John. Thank you for the presentation.
Okay.
I have returned to my home country, Turkey, about 2 years ago. I'm a teacher of lighting for many years. Mostly did that in the United States. So I have been lucky with organizations such as IALD, IESNA, but I was wondering, there was a program I was also following and using a lot. It was called Lighting Facts. It was the US Department of Energy's initiative for making sure that the LED technology was third-party tested for certain productions. What is the counterpart, or if there's anything similar in the UK? I wanted to ask you what that's called, or probably it's not going to be the same thing. But oh, by the way, I also recently discovered that I can't access Department of Energy's Lighting Facts anymore.
Oh.
After the last administration. I think things have changed.
Right.
Greatly. So anyways, what would you recommend in terms of the UK? Because I really used it for my projects. apart from teaching, I did small projects whenever I could find time. So sometimes globally. And for that part of the world, what's the source you recommend for third-party testing, that sort of organization? Thank you.
The only organization I know of is a lighting industry association. They basically, the manufacturers and suppliers belong to them. So whether it's third party or not is questionable, but I don't know whether they put the information on their website, but they're the only place I know that does third party assessments.
Thank you.
Okay.
Actually, we have one message on the chat.
One message. I just see hello everybody from Lambros, and then Berker says hello Lambros.
Sorry, maybe it's direct to me.
Any other? I can't see.
This is the European potential risks to human health of LEDs. Opinion of potential risks to human health of light emitted. He said that there is a research study about the human health of LEDs from the European Union at 2018. And he's asked for us, it will be a process to update of this document.
I think it's unlikely. I don't think the commissioning or part of the European Commission expected the answer that I gave, because as you probably see, I was the rapporteur for that review, and they wanted to say that LEDs were dangerous, but the evidence doesn't say that. And so I think it's quite a balanced report. Obviously, I'm biased on that. If they do revise it, they probably won't invite me. Now we're outside Europe. But it was an interesting experience to be with them while they drafted it.